Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining our diagnostic training session today. Now, what you're about to see is a pre-recorded training session we did over in the United States. But be assured that a lot of the material that we cover is really applicable to any automotive application. So just be aware that yes, it is a lot of North American vehicles, but a lot of the same principles apply over in the UK as well. Now, if you have any questions, if you're watching this during the premiere, you can just leave it in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And if you're watching this after the premiere, then just feel free to leave a comment underneath the video, and we'll get to those as we can as well. So my name is Jason Gabrenas. I'm one of Snap-on Diagnostics technical trainers. I've been in the training department since 2013, traveling around North America, helping techs and shop owners get the most out of their diagnostic equipment. Before I did that, it was a couple years as a diagnostic sales rep at Snap-on, so I had a group of about 30 different franchisees I worked with, as well as the shops that they service, in order to help everyone get the most out of their diagnostic needs. Then before I did that, it was 8 years at Subaru, so I worked in a dealership, and over time, I guess, I just became that default diag guy in the shop. So I always ended up having the drivability problems, the intermittent problems, the weird wiring problems that would show up on those cars. And that's really where I cut my diagnostic teeth, was trying to figure out all those weird head scratcher type cars that had come into my bay. Then before that, a bunch of other miscellaneous wrenching jobs. Been a little over 25 years under hood experience for me. So we're going to talk today about scanner versus scope diagnosis. So we're not going to talk about one's better than the other, so to say, like a battle, right? We're going to talk more about which is better for which condition, which is better for which kind of signal I'm trying to look at, right? So let's just dive right in. So if we think about our two different types of diagnostic tools, we have scanners and scopes, of course. Now, scanners, I like to think of as a really nice compass. It's going to point you in the right direction. It's going to show you where you need to go, where you need to look, but it's really only showing you half of what's going on under the hood, showing you the effect after it already happened, right? So for every effect, we need a cause as well. So in order to find that cause, that's where the scope is going to come into play. We're going to be actually testing it at the component level before it gets into the ECM. Now, if we think about a vehicle's computer, let's think of it like a house. It's got a front door, it's got a back door. It's actually really got two back doors, but we'll get into that in a minute. So in the front door, coming in as my inputs, is going to be my NOx sensor, my coolant temp sensor, my oxygen sensor, all those inputs that come into the computer. The computer is then going to take that data and process it however it is programmed to do so, and that is a big deal. That's why sometimes they screw up, and that's why we have things called reflashes, right? So there are also inside this house, we keep with that metaphor, there's two rooms inside this house. So one side is my OEM VIN-specific room, and that's whatever is in there is up to the manufacturer's discretion. They can do whatever they want for, how does it set codes? What kind of data do we show? What do we want in here? On the OBD2 side of the room, that is mandated by the government. So they say, okay, you can have, this is the data you need to have. This is the threshold level of failure before you set a code, that sort of thing. So that's all mandated. So that should be the same across the board on any vehicle. Like I said, on the OEM side, it can be whatever the manufacturer wants it to be. Sometimes it's the same. Sometimes that threshold level's higher. Sometimes the threshold level's lower. I've scanned plenty of vehicles in my day where if you go look on the OBD2 side, there's no codes, and the OEM side, there's 3, or vice versa. It can go either way, just depending on what those threshold levels are if they're not the same. So we need to make sure we check both sides. Now, there's a couple different ways we'll talk about throughout this where we can check both sides. We can actually break down this wall a little bit and go in between as well. But if I was going to go into the OEM side only or mainly, that's where I use the scanner icon if we got a Snap-on tool. And then for my OBD2 side, if I wanted to go just in there, that's OBD direct, right? So that gets in there, that one gets in there. And sometimes, like I said, we can have some crossover. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's all about having the right tool for the job. So whatever signals I'm trying to read or whatever job I'm trying to do on the job, right? So codes for the scan tool, obviously. So that's the main reason most of us will pull out a scan tool is to check the car for codes, right? So pre and post scans, checking for codes. Next thing's process data. Remember how I said that's coming out the back of the computer, that data. But that's what we use to read process data. Functional tests, of course, taking over that computer and doing bidirectional functions maybe, or maybe even a scripted automated test to walk us through a pass-fail on an evap system or something like that would be a functional test. And then resets and relearns. So think about after I replace something on a vehicle, I got to do a reset or a relearn or a calibration or something like that. So that's mainly what we use the scan tools for, right? For a scope, we're going to be testing signals, whatever they might be. So it could be voltage, could be current, could be pressure, could be resistance, could be temperature, could be a whole host of different things that we're testing with it. So we just want to verify really what's going into the computer is what the computer is telling me that's coming out of the computer, basically. And you might think, well, why not just rely on the data? I have a scan tool already, and I can look at the data, and I can get by just fine. And yeah, maybe you can for 90% of the time or 80% of the time or whatever it is. But then when you get that one vehicle that's just kicking your butt and you just can't figure out what the problem is, maybe the data wasn't necessarily the full picture, right? If we think about data over the history of scan tools, way back to the 80s, way back in the 80s, your scan tool would have maybe 5 or 6 PIDs on there because there really wasn't a whole lot of sensors on the vehicle, not a whole lot of things you needed to see. They weren't all that complicated back then. And if you're lucky, those numbers might change every few seconds, right? Because the data rate on the computer wasn't that fast, and granted, the data rate on the scan tool didn't have to be that fast because the car wasn't that fast. Nowadays, though, these digital readings change too rapidly to read at 10 times a second or faster. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time reading a number if it's changing 10 times a second on the screen in front of me. Right? It's valuable data. It's good to have, but it's often too fast and too much to comprehend. We could have 400, 500, 600 PIDs on a car. Now there are ways to mitigate that as well by custom data lists and things like that. But just relying on the data, not necessarily going to get you all the way there. Few years down the road, after the first scan tools, we came out with a graphing scan tool. So in that case, well, the graphs does, and pretty much any scan tool on the market nowadays has graphing. But what a graph is a recorded history of those numbers plotted over time of that processed information. So we looked at the numbers on the previous screen, numbers changing 10 times a second. Well, then they're just going to make pretty pictures and pretty graphs once we lay them out that way. Right? So you can see trends. Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are things just not doing anything at all? And that's a useful clue as to where I might need to look next, right? So for example, we were looking at like the coolant temperature sensor. I was reading like 40 degrees or minus 40 degrees, and it was 85 degrees outside. Then we know we need to check that coolant temp sensor. We don't just replace it. We want to check it and test it and verify that it actually has failed at the sensor. Could have failed somewhere in between too, and we might have a wiring harness issue, right? So we don't know. That's why we always need to check that both sides of the equation. And the difference really is in the details. So here we have process data, scanner data hooked up to the OBD2 port on a car, reading oxygen sensor voltage. This down here is a lab scope hooked up to the same oxygen sensor reading the same voltage. These two red boxes show the same amount of time passing. And I think if you looked at the two of these, you would agree that there's way more detail in this scope pattern because it's hooked up directly to the oxygen sensor, reading it right off the oxygen sensor. So if these two little glitches were actually glitches, and we wouldn't be able to catch that with the scan tool. Now, it's not really the scan tool's fault. It's more the car's fault if you think about it, because the car's got to take a sample of the data, process it, and send that data stream to the tool. Take a sample, process it, send it to the scan tool. Every time that happens, we lose a little bit of resolution in that data. Even if it's very quick, like nowadays, we can get some pretty quick data, there's still going to be that little lag. And once again, it's the computer's interpretation of what it sees based on its inputs. Here's another example. Did this on mass airflow sensor on my car a few weeks ago. So here is at the sensor. Here is data over here, and we see right now 1.3 and reading 1.3. Perfect. So it's reading good. So I know that the connection from here to the back of the computer should be okay. But what happens if I actually start the engine and rev it up a couple times? Let's see how fast the scanner reacts versus how quick the scope reacts, and just take a look at this. Car's on, running, and then I did a brake, step on the brake, step on the gas, put it in drive type of thing where it's, revving up the engine, putting a load on the engine. And you can see 1, 2, 3 times did it. And the scan tool didn't exactly react, did it? It reacted a little bit. But if we run our cursors up on the peak of this, which you see is not nearly any detail in there compared to this, the actual peak that we got on the second one, so 1, 2, 3, right? So on the second one, we got 2.89. This one says 2.6 over here on that peak, right? Because that's got to be that peak, because that was the third one. So you can see that lag that's going on between the scan tool and the scope. Right? So you'll see much greater detail, be able to find much smaller glitches using the scope versus using the scan tool. Now, what is a scope anyways? I like to think of it as a window. It's a little window I'm going to look into. It's going to tell me what a measurement, whatever that happens to be, voltage or current or what have you, over a period of time. And I can change the size of the window. When I do change the size of the window, what I'm really trying to do is just get the picture on the screen so I can view it. Maybe I got to make it a little bit taller. Maybe I got to make it a little bit shorter. Maybe I got to make it a little bit wider. All you're doing is just changing the size of the window. The signal's not going to change based on what you do in here. It's just changing the size of the window. So a few things we can check both ways. Injector pulse is one of them. So in this case, we are hooked up on a scope with 3 channels, and we can check it both electrically, mechanically, and the fuel pressure. Hydraulically. So channel 1, the yellow channel, is going to be our voltage. So this is going to check and make sure the circuit is intact and that the driver is doing what it's supposed to do, pulling it down to ground and all that. The green wire is a low amp probe around the injector wire, and we can see how the current flows through to open up the injector. That's where it opens right there, and how it builds up until it shuts off. And then we can see the pressure. Pressure is about 35 psi running, and then it drops a little bit when it opens. You see it doesn't drop a ton. It doesn't even drop 5 psi. But it's enough to notice a drop, and then when it closes, we get a big spike, because if you think about it, all that fuel is going through the injector, and all of a sudden the door closes. Pinto closes, can't get through, and now I got all this other fuel stacking up behind me, so it has nowhere else to go, so it just goes back a little bit, and then we get a little pulse, and you see very quickly it just recovers back to about that 35 psi. So by looking at this, I would know that this fuel injector is open. It's spraying fuel because the pressure is dropping. I know that it's opening here. This is actually the point where it closes, so you want to actually be able to do all of that. Way more detail in other videos if you need it. I can also check this against the scanner data, because if you think about what this is right here, this is the injector driver grounding the injector to turn it on. So there is a PID to match that, because that is a commanded pulse width of that injector. So if we look over here, fuel injection pulse, in milliseconds at that cursor, 3.33. Down here, delta time on my cursor, 3.33. They match, right? So that's a good check on that. Don't know where they might not match. Don't know what occurrence that might happen. But if I had some sort of issue with my computer, I suppose it might. Or if I had some sort of issue with my injector, I suppose it might. Timing issues. This is pretty popular as well. So if we think about, if you're in any Facebook groups or anything like that for diagnostics or scopes or anything, oftentimes, multiple times a week, it's, hey, does anybody have a known good cam crank pattern for this? Whatever it happens to be. Because they want to check for maybe a timing chain that's stretched or a belt that slipped, a tooth or something like that, just to make sure the timing is correct. So in this case, have a crankshaft, which is a yellow. That's an analog crank sensor, so it goes on either side of 0, you see. And then on this crank sensor, we have a gap and a gap. So there's a double gap there on one side of the sprocket. And then there's another gap on the other side, one gap on the other side of the sprocket, then double gap, single gap, double gap. So that way the computer knows whether, where it is rotationally in the 720 degrees it's got to make. Then we have blue channel's one cam sensor, green channel's the other cam sensor. It's got 2 cam sensors on this one. And we see this blue one lines up, lines up, lines up, lines up. The green one lines up, lines up, lines up. And they line up together. So this is an example of a known good pattern on this vehicle, because everything lines up where it should. Now, what if I had a problem on this vehicle? Well, if, say, one of the cam sensors shifts off to one side, then I know I might have a problem there. Maybe it's off a tooth or something like that. But in this case, it's happening before it normally would have. So that would be advanced. And if you think about left is earlier on in the pattern, so that would be advanced on the left. Conversely, if it goes the other way and it's off the other direction, then we know it's retarded timing. So by even being able to view this and taking a look, you can understand without having to take the engine apart what might be going on. Is one of the cams out of time, or whatever it happens to be. Let's talk ignition tests. Another test that we can do without having to open up the engine and see what's going on inside the cylinder and with the ignition system in general. So this is a cranking ignition test. So this is testing the ignition system while cranking, putting it under a load, making sure the fuel is off so it doesn't fire, but we want to see what it's doing while it's cranking the engine over. And in this case, this is a known good. These are all relatively the same height. That's what you want to look for the firing lines. You want to make sure they're relatively close to the same height. Make sure they're fairly even. Here's an example on the same vehicle before we fixed it. So this was getting a tune-up. In the middle of the tune-up, we replaced 3 of the 4 plugs. Can you guess which 3? Pretty obvious if you remember the last slide. So these 3 are fairly close together, and this one's super high. The reason it's super high is because that's the firing line. That's the initial arc to get the spark started on the spark plug. So these had worn out spark plugs, 120,000, 130,000. I don't remember exactly when I did it, but so the gap on that spark plug was larger than all the other spark plugs. So in this case, we could see, oh, there's the culprit right there. So if you have a drivability problem, you can hook up to all the coils, and you can see, oh, look at that. Got a problem there. That's the cylinder I want to look at. And then we also have it set up with the firing order down here, 1324. Also good. We can also see conditions in the cylinder itself as to rich or lean. So in this case, this is a good cylinder. We want to look at the spark line, not the firing line in this case. So on the spark line, we see it's fairly level, a little bit of turbulence. And that little bit of turbulence is the spark actually occurring and the flame front going out from the spark. So the spark will have a little bit of up and down turbulence due to the turbulence inside the cylinder. So you're going to be a little bit richer here, and you're going to be a little bit leaner there, and so on and so forth. So if it's lean, the voltage is going to increase. If it's rich, the voltage will decrease. And we'll be able to see just at the molecular level almost what's going on in there, right? Kind of crazy nerdy stuff, but it's helpful. If you don't see any turbulence, you don't have combustion. Simple as that. Yeah, the spark might have occurred, but if I don't have any turbulence, nothing happened. In this case, same cylinder, same vehicle, same time. We decided to pinch off the fuel line going to the fuel rail, just with there's some pinch off pliers, right? So we didn't want to pinch it all the way off, so we didn't want the car to stall, but enough to make it so it would read lean. So it was getting down to where it was getting almost ready to stall, but you can see normal amount of fuel, and then once it ran out of that normal amount of fuel, it went up because voltage goes up when it's lean, right? So up is lean. And then if you see a downward shift, that is going to be rich. So up is lean, down is rich. How about fuel pump current ramp? That is a very helpful test to do to check the condition of the pump itself internally, as well as check the speed of the pump. So speed is critical to drivability. The pressure of the fuel is dictated by the pressure regulator, and the volume of the fuel is dictated by how fast the pump is turning. If the pump is turning slow, if the pump is worn out, getting ready to go, you will be able to tell how fast that pump is turning and maybe recommend a replacement without having to drop the tank, without having to do any of that stuff. So in this case, what we want to do is pull a fuse or a relay or get it somewhere in the circuit for the fuel pump, with it having just the fuel pump on the circuit, because we got to be able to see that. Each of these bumps is one of the commutator segments in the electric motor on a brushed motor, going up and down as the current flow increases and decreases as it spins around. What the current should be is going to depend on the vehicle, depend on the pump, depend on how much fuel's in the tank, and it'll vary depending on how much fuel's in the tank, even on the same pump on the same car. We don't want to see anything super high, like 12, 15 amps or whatever, but 5, 6, 7 amps, that's okay. You want to make sure they're fairly rounded. You want to make sure there aren't any missing, because if there's any missing, that could be a bad commutator segment, and that would indicate you might be having a intermittent no start problem, because if it stops on that bad bad commutator segment, it's not going to be able to send current through it to get it to spin again. Also, most automotive fuel pumps have 8 commutator segments. So by knowing this, we can put in some markers and cursors, and then we can mark out where is 1 revolution. So if I call this one segment 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and back to 1 again. So if I do that, that's 1 revolution of the pump. Now, there's a little math equation we can use. 1 revolution in this case is 7.57 milliseconds. Pull out my calculator. Keep the values the same. So 60,000 milliseconds in a minute divided by 7.57 gives me 7,926 RPM, give or take. Let this one's go. So that's a good, healthy fuel pump. If I get above 5,000 or 6,000, I know I'm in good shape. This one's actually a variable RPM pump too, but anything over 5,000 to 6,000 RPM is a good rule of thumb. It's where you want to be. Anything below around 3,000 RPM, you might start having drivability problems, especially under load, because that means the pump can't get the fuel to the front fast enough because it's not spinning fast enough to get it up there. Might get some cavitation or hesitation going up a hill or something like that. So that's an easy test to do, and it's non-invasive. I just have to pull a fuse or something, use a low amp probe. Don't have to drop the tank, don't have to drain any fuel, don't have to do any of that. And we got running compression. That's another thing that we can do with a scope. So this is a pretty popular one too. A lot of folks ask for help interpreting what they're seeing on the screen when they do it and how to do it and so on. Once again, other videos exist on that on our channel, so you can take a look at those. This is meant to be a high-level overview tonight, right? So we can see as the piston climbs up, it is going to increase compression in the cylinder and pressure in the cylinder. Somewhere before top dead center, we are going to have an ignition event. It gets to top dead center, and then it gets blown back down. And as it goes back down, it's going to go down eventually, creating a vacuum pocket. And then we'll have some valve overlap here. And then we'll have the exhaust. In this case, it's a 4-cylinder engine. This is one of the cylinders, and then those are the other 3 cylinders we can see in the exhaust. Get little bumps there. And then we'll have a little bit more valve overlap over here. And then we'll have the intake come in, comes down, pull the vacuum pocket, and then we compress that air-fuel mixture up, and then we do the same thing back again. You should be doing a running compression test with the plug out. So because the plug's out, you want to unplug the fuel injector if possible. Disable the fuel injector somehow on the cylinder because you don't want to wash down the cylinders. Now that being said, me being me, and being my own car, so if I mess it up, it's my fault. I decided I wanted to see kind of the whole picture. I wanted to see where everything was and what everything was kind of doing as far as what's going on in the cylinder. So once again, pressure goes up. This is current ramp on a coil. So this part right here, the flat part where it goes down, that's where the ignition event starts. So you can see it's a little bit before top dead center. It's probably about like here. Goes up, comes down. Get our valve overlap. Comes in, get our valve overlap here. Exhaust. Exhaust goes up, 1, 2, and then my fuel injector fires right before my intake valves open. Got a little overlap there. Comes in. Now you can see my pattern gets a little different over here, doesn't it? Because now we have fuel and air and turbulence, right? And then coming down, we get our vacuum pocket, and then we get our compression again, and then coming back down. I just thought that was kind of an interesting visualization of what's going on in the engine. So let's digress to the scan tool, shall we? So in this case, we'll go into the scanner first because we talked about that earlier, how we can go through the wall, so to speak, and how do I get to generic functions. A couple different ways we can do this. We can go into engine itself if you want to, engine control module. You can see you got codes, data, functional tests, and all that. The majority of vehicles that we cover, I guess as long as it's supported, and most of them do, but I suppose there's some that aren't, so I can't say every vehicle, but on the ones that support it, which is most of them, we have generic functions on the menu as well. So I can come in here and look at my readiness monitors, mode 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, and 9 in this case. So we're missing a couple modes. That's okay. We can still get what we need, you know, if we wanted to go into mode 6 or something, or what needed the VIN or the calibration ID or something like that, we can just pop in there. Another way we can do it is if we go into code scan and do a pre-scan on the vehicle. Okay, so there's my pre-scan. I got 2 codes here. And if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we're going to see we also pull the OBD2 codes on the report and the mode 10 codes on the report, so the permanent code. Also pull the readiness monitors, complete or not complete. So this is all OBD2 generic side of the computer, and it pulls it through on the pre-scan, which is nice. Also from here, if we wanted to go into engine, we can just click on that word that says engine, and then that'll bring us back to where we can go into generic functions as well. So pretty helpful. Now, we talked about looking at things going in and going out and comparing. So let's say I wanted to pull up data on this. I got to go the other way, don't I? Yes, I do. Okay, so let's say I wanted to check an oxygen sensor on this. What year was that anyway? That was a 16. Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, so we'll go into guided component tests. Toyota over here. 16 Camry. What's that thing right there? Okay. Engine, and go into the oxygen sensor. And we want to check the rear O2 sensor because this one's got a front AF sensor and you can't test it that way. We go into component information. Sensor is a zirconia type sensor used to monitor exhaust gases for the presence of oxygen. Depending on the level of oxygen in the exhaust stream, sensor can inform the ECM of rich or lean fuel mixture condition. The ECM will then add or subtract fuel trim to obtain an ideal mixture. That's got our pinouts over here. Then we can go back and we can go to O2 sensor tests. And this one says a bench test. It could do this in the car too. What I'm really looking for is I want to compare the voltage. So I need something that reads the voltage on there. So generally speaking, on a normally operating oxygen sensor, so this says it passes the bench test, reinstall in the vehicle and connect the voltmeter or a scope in this case. Voltage should say either below 0.2 volts or above 0.8 volts for long periods of time, seeing the catalyst has the ability to store and use oxygen. So if I hit V meter, it's going to come up. And I think I got, yeah, okay. So let's say I was like here. All right. And I want to compare this to what's going on in my scanner. So this being a Zeus, a Windows-based tool, I can go up and hit meter. And meter, again, makes it a window, right? Windows-based. Come down here to home screen, go back to my scanner, and load into my Camry. And then pull up my engine and pull up my data. Go to my oxygen sensor data. Come over here, oxygen sensor bank 1, sensor 2. I can pull that up partial screen, or I want to pull up full screen. I can do that too. And there we go. Now we see it's, don't mind the numbers. This is a simulator I got on here, so it just runs like a random number generator. So don't really pay attention to the actual numbers. Let's just compare the pattern. Come over here to my scope, pull up my scope. And if I wanted to see it side by side, I can go over here to the side, go over here, and see what it looks like. Now, if I have this at the sensor, it could mean I have a flatline sensor, and the sensor is just not reading. But why would the computer be doing stuff like this if the sensor is not reading? So it's supposed to be based on the input. So if it's flat here and doing stuff here, there could very well be a problem. However, if I'm over here before it gets into the car or before it gets into the computer, and I'm seeing the ups and downs and all arounds, just like I'm seeing on the left side. And this is hard to do with a knob, but you kind of get the gist, right? See if they kind of look like they're doing the same, voltage ranges are doing the same, then you're probably okay. And if I got this flat line at 0, then yeah, that's not good either. All right, so that is our going in on the right-hand side and going out on the left-hand side. So front door, back door, and we can do it on the same screen if we want. So that is scanner versus scope. And with that, that's our time here today. So make sure you tune in for new diagnostic content every week. We'll be premiering a new video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. UK time, so make sure to check it out here on our YouTube channel. Please make sure you also subscribe, thumbs up, and ring that little notification bell so you'll know anytime we post new content. With that, time for questions. Now, if you have any questions, once again, if you're watching this on the Premiere, just leave it in the live chat and we'll do our best to answer those. Otherwise, leave a comment under the video and we'll get to those as we monitor those comments as well. So I'd like to thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day to learning a little bit more about how you might be able to be more efficient at diagnosing vehicles using some of the information that we've been giving you today. Hopefully we'll see you next week, and we'll see you on any of our other videos. Have a good week, have a good night, and take care.